Really thrilled today to have one of our dear associates, Frank Thompson, talking to us. And now Frank is, as many of you know, has had a long and distinguished career in many facets, an accountant by training, which we won't hold against him, but we're in corporate life. And then more relevant to us in today's discussion, the last 15 or so years before he retired, was the CEO of Advitech, a very prominent educational institution here in South Africa, with interest in multitude of educational bodies, ranging from early school learning right through to tertiary education. And still to this day consults both here and internationally on matters of education, and certainly works a lot with a group in America on creating new university opportunities into Africa. So he is really up to speed with education, and particularly where education could, should, might go. And I think that's really interesting for us, because I think in a world that is changing so fast, it really is important that we just rethink things and look at things from a different perspective and don't get stuck in a paradigm that might well have gone. So Frank, why don't we hand over to you? You're going to speak, I think, for 20, 25 minutes, and then we're going to open this into what I hope will become a very vibrant discussion. So why don't I just hand over to you, and we look forward to it. Frank.
Thank you very much, Pete, and greetings to everybody. Great to have you join us, and welcome to the new world of communication, where you have to do webinars to talk to people. Pete, in particular, thank you for those kind words. Many of them were hopefully true, and the rest I'll take as read, but thank you. So may we have the next slide, please, next. Well, there is the outcome of some UNISA research on education. And it is true that education makes a significant difference to people's economic well-being. But there are also correlations between quality of life and levels of satisfaction or happiness on the one hand, and the amount of education on the other. So it will come as no surprise to all of you to discover, perhaps to know well already, that education and the world of jobs and employment is a constant headliner in the news and the media and in the discourse and discussions of society. I've included, for your interest, an article from today's newspapers in Johannesburg referring to SA's education apocalypse. And it is just typical of the fact that on an almost daily basis, attention is turned towards education and to the goings on there. Next slide, please, next. Research suggests that Africa is far behind the world in formal education and employment. This picture from a chap called Max Rosa, an Oxford scholar and historian who specializes in visualization of key data that he believes the world needs to know about, just illustrates the poverty of progress in higher education. The reason why I've chosen higher education is because it has been my most intense area of focus for the last 5 or 6 years. And I think Africa in particular. But I hope and believe that the conclusions and perhaps the insights that we might discuss today have more application than just to higher education in Africa. But much of the talk that follows is focused on higher education. Research suggests that Africa needs to quintuple its higher education student numbers, that's multiplying by 5, just to match the world average of education at this level. And that's not all. If we can go to the next slide, please, next. We also need to consider the challenge of the demographic dividend that Africa is heading towards. And the choice of the term demographic dividend is very apt because it is a benefit. So how does a demographic dividend work? Those of us who have followed the stories of wildlife will know that for most wildlife species, the journey from pregnancy, birth, and then growing up to reach the stage where you're able to make your contribution to the gene pool is an extremely fraught and dangerous journey with a rather low survival rate. In fact, for humans, that was no less true until only about 100 or fewer years ago. And in the time of the Industrial Revolution in the UK, only about a third of pregnancies ended in offspring that reached maturity. However, the demographic dividend plays out as these pictures suggest. It is not drawings of Grecian urns. In phase one, the improvements in mother and child healthcare and in the safety of childbirth create a situation with a big population bulge that happens at a very young age. And then in phase two, the advent of urbanization and the improvement in the education and liberation of women contribute to a decline in the birth rate, the fertility rate. And the result, as you see, is a very substantial bulge in the working age population. And in proportion to the number of youngsters and past working age people who depend on the economic output of the people in the working age group, there is an enormous increase in the production of resources and benefits for all people. And then in phase three, that bulge moves through into the post-working age population, and we enter what is known as the demographic desert. This phenomenon of a demographic dividend has been observed to take place in all major geographies in the world, typically once only, except in Africa. And Africa still has to confront its demographic dividend and the opportunity which it presents. But of course, the world is changing, and Africa's demographic dividend is set to take place in a post-industrial, even a post-employment, knowledge-based and interconnected world that places a high premium on education. Now, we all know that Africa has a vast unskilled labor pool, or does it? More on that later on. But interestingly, a few years ago, less than 5% of the price of an iPhone was attributable to skilled artisanal work. More than 95% of the price was derived from high-level technological, logistical, and financial expertise, and none, zero, came from unskilled work. Now, the choice of an iPhone is that it is a very large-scale and fairly ubiquitous industrial product of the times, and there is no place in that type of manufacturing activity for unskilled labor. The world of work is changing at unprecedented speed, and yet young people are being educated for a future in which present-day jobs will not exist, and they will pursue careers, and I will argue modes of working that are yet unknown. So perhaps the need to quintuple the number of higher education students in Africa is a low estimate. Maybe the number needs to increase by an order of magnitude to accommodate all of those who will be in position to participate if they're successful in the demographic dividend. Next slide, please, next. So the question is what to do about this. And there are obviously a number of different answers. Next slide. Firstly, we could close the gap created by this need to increase higher education numbers by an order of magnitude by adding universities. There are about 15 million higher education students in Africa compared to a population of some 400 odd million between 18 and 34. This would require the appointment of thousands of qualified academics, presumably mostly PhDs, who simply neither exist at present and nor are being graduated rapidly enough to close this gap. At another level, there are about 750 universities serving 1.2 billion Africans, compared to about 5,000 universities and colleges serving 325 million Americans. Now, there is some redundancy in the American system, but putting these two sets of data together, we would estimate that you need about 3,000 new African higher education institutions. Unfortunately, in its present state of development, Africa lacks the human, be they academics or other, infrastructural or financial resources to achieve this growth in time to harvest its demographic dividend in the world envisaged and described. So we can try something else. We can do what many politicians in Africa are in fact doing about it, and that is to give up and simply to condemn Africa to a future of peonage without hope. This would be to squander the demographic dividend. You want to take that call quickly? Next slide, please. Or we can change the whole picture to make mass education for Africa practicable and achievable. Well, is this possible or is it just a pipe dream? And if so, what steps are needed? Next slide, please. The existing Bologna model, as it is known, of higher education is so called because it dates back to the foundation of Bologna University in the Middle Ages, almost 1,000 years ago in 1088. And it remains to this day the oldest continuously existing university in the world. And by the way, that rearward-looking brag piece is typical of universities. They celebrate how many years they've existed rather than how many years they are going to. The primary purpose of universities 1,000 years ago was primarily to train the priesthood and perhaps also to educate some of the sons of the nobility to enable them better to manage and run their vast estates. So the student population was a very small proportion of the total. It was relatively easy for society to afford it. And it became a much sought after opportunity for some people. Unfortunately, it was not designed with efficiency and productivity in mind. It is a very wasteful use of resources and certainly not the best use of a scarce resource, namely academic teaching. And those of us who had the good fortune to go to a Bologna model university will know that less than half of the year is used for teaching and learning, and the balance are the extensive, wonderful vacations we enjoyed and the job opportunities we had to pursue to earn enough money to pay for the university, or at least supplement our pocket money. So the university simply does not make the best use of the resources, and they are inefficient, wasteful, and unproductive, as I said. And arguably, they are no longer fit for the purpose in an age when large, massive scale higher education of populations is needed to enable them to service the work requirements that modern society engenders. In my view, this obsolete model of universities needs urgent revision, as do the regulatory regimes applied by governments. So let us look now at the two aspects that have been raised. First, let's talk about education and rethinking higher education. And I will argue that education and education leadership needs to embrace these changes in order better to prepare students for the world they will be stepping into. The first point, the world of knowledge and expertise is today a global world and a boundaryless world. And consequently, education cannot be governed in terms of narrow, sovereign, nationalistic political agendas. You cannot have silos of South African education regulated by South Africa and American and British and Finnish or Zambian or Egyptian or name the geography. They all have their own little set of rules. The second point is that the power of technology and effective, affordable, modern communication needs to be harnessed to leverage the contribution of skilled academics at scale. And as a sidebar to this point, I will argue that the best academics who transform and inspire the lives of thousands or perhaps tens of thousands of young students simultaneously need to be recognized and rewarded on the same scale as a Cristiano Ronaldo or a Leo Messi, rather than as at present at the same rate as a journeyman artisan. And the sidebar to that particular comment is that the less competent academics whose contribution in leading, inspiring, and educating is unsatisfactory will inevitably, I fear, lose their jobs and lead to a saving. The third point is that well understood measurements of output and productivity need to trump and apply ahead of tenure or simply holding the position for a long time in order to assess academic worth. And then lastly, universities or higher education institutions need to focus on relevant teaching and learning that is geared to the present and future needs of society. Pedagogies, that means teaching and learning, need to develop and not remain trapped in an old paradigm of rote learning and examination of what is learnt based on memory. Other key university functions like research and publication and the storage and the communication and dissemination of knowledge need to be protected, developed, and encouraged alongside this enhanced learning job. Next slide, please. We then move to consider the real heart of this contribution, which is the new world of work. As I said, I think the nature of teaching and learning needs to be re-engineered to match the needs of the new world of work. And in particular, that my first comment is that students need less to learn what they need to know, because after all, everything's available on the World Wide Web. Students rather need to learn more about why they need that particular learning and how to use it. This is in fact not so easy to find on the internet, if at all. And it is an inspiring place for really good teachers. Once people know why they need to know something and how to use it, they can go and find the what for themselves. There will be far fewer traditional careers with ladders to climb and employers looking permanently to hire skills and labor. And next slide. The world of self-employment, entrepreneurship, a deepening of the gig economy will become the dominant mode of earning a living. And people will have to hustle for a living, often doing several gigs at the same time. Next slide, please. Africa is already far down this road, demonstrating incredible creativity, innovation, resilience, and anti-fragility. Let me explain this graphic to you. The darker the color pink, the greater the proportion of workers who are employed in so-called vulnerable employment. I should explain that this is an ILO, the International Labour Organization slide. And being the ILO, they consider anybody who is self-employed or casually employed or not permanently employed with a nice contract and a pension with medical aid is vulnerable. Unfortunately, in Africa and other parts of the third world, but particularly Africa, this so-called vulnerable employment is the dominant mode of employment. Whereas in the OECD and first world countries, there is a preponderance of traditional employment. So you will see that this new world of work, as experienced in Africa, is much more significant perhaps than traditional kinds of job and career. And the point is that traditional institutions of learning and many modes of thinking amongst backward-looking organizations, I could name names, but I shan't, remain far behind these developments. And here we come to the key point. The most fundamental shift in the world of work is that instead of being given a job with someone to report to and people reporting to you, with a job description and KPIs that slots into a hierarchy, or being employed or deployed or given a position, individuals will have to create, define, and execute their own role in this world of work. And one thing I can assure you is that there remains, in spite of this being the post-employment world, there is still plenty of work. And individuals will need themselves to give that task that they take up for themselves meaning and worth and significance, so that it has a value to society and thus becomes worthy of reward, both in economic and in other ways. And for me, that is the crux of the change in the world of work. Instead of being given a job, you will have to look at this huge, if not examined carefully, amorphous bundle of jobs or work that needs to be done. And you will have to carve out your own role in that. And you will have to make it worthy of note and worthy of reward and worthy of recognition. You will no longer be able to go and apply for a job in the way beloved of HR departments and organized labor and, sadly, universities. And that is, to me, the most important point about this new world of work. And the next slide, please. Whereas competence is temporary, it is temporary both in terms of demand, because the competencies that people may have had before are no longer required, or they may be temporary in terms of supply, in that they are no longer learnt or applicable. Think, for example, of the tragic case of the person whose competence in life was a skill in developing camera film. That competence is gone. Think of somebody who conducted surgery in the days before robot surgery was possible. That competence is no longer required. And there are numerous examples. So to me, competence is temporary or transitory, whereas education needs to equip people with the knowledge and the confidence to trust their judgment and empower them to know what to do when they don't know what to do, which is a phrase that we use in Lead with Humanity. And this education creates sustainable ability. And next slide. I think hope is the most important outcome of education, but not Pollyanna hope, realistic, informed, purposeful hope. Without hope, nothing is possible. But with hope, the most powerful force in the human makeup, anything is possible. And that concludes my remarks. I would like to hear any questions or comments from all of you. Thank you very much indeed.